Your eyes, a gift from God. Hard to imagine life without them. But you can't always trust what you see. Life is full of things that can't be seen with the naked eye. That's where God comes in. We see a problem, He sees a solution. We see weakness, He sees strength. As you're looking for answers, keep one thing in mind. You'll need more than eyes to see the things that matter. Believing is seeing.
When we speak of the natural, we're talking about things in accordance with the laws that God has established by which the world works. Science can exist because there are natural laws that through the process of observation and testing have been deemed to be consistently dependable so that we can live our lives based on those laws. We call them the laws of nature. But when we talk about the supernatural, we're talking about when God trumps His own laws. When God rises above His own laws to do something outside of those laws to demonstrate that He is not limited to the natural of His laws, but is in fact supernatural. That is, He can supersede His own laws as He so chooses. In this series, we're calling Believing is Seeing, Experiencing the Supernatural. We are discovering and have discovered already how God works based on faith to do things outside of the natural scheme and order of nature. Today is no different, but with a twist. Jesus Christ, according to chapter 2, verse 1, has come back to Capernaum. He's come back. That means He was already there. Let me summarize what's been going on with Jesus. He's hit a stride. Jesus right now has hit a stride, and He's riding a wave of popularity. Chapter 1, verse 37, Simon and the companions find Him, and they said to Him, "Everybody looking for you. Where you go? You've gone off. Everybody's looking for you." Jesus responds by saying in chapter 1, verse 38, "Let us go somewhere else to the towns nearby so that I can preach there also, for that is what I came for." In other words, the folk want my miracles, they don't want my sermons. So Jesus Christ takes a break from Capernaum. But after He takes his break, He comes back. And that opens up this most staring story. Stay with me. I think you will find some unique things here for your experience of the supernatural. Many were gathered together so that, verse 2, there was no longer room, not even near the door, as He was speaking to them. And in the midst of His sermon, something takes place. And they came bringing to Him a paralytic carried by 4 men. They came bringing to Him a paralyzed individual. Now, if he's paralyzed, he can't walk. For one reason or another, his muscles have stopped working, his limbs have stopped functioning, and he is stuck in a condition he can't get himself out of. He is paralyzed. Here we have a man who is in a hopeless situation. And let me tell you how you can know when you're in a hopeless situation. You know you're in a hopeless situation when you can't get out of it by yourself. He can't get out of this. He can't move on his own. Now, there are a lot of kind of paralysis that goes on. There is the obvious one, physical paralysis, but you can be mentally paralyzed. Stuck in a mindset you can't shake. You can be circumstantially paralyzed by situations you can't get out of. You can be paralyzed by an addiction. You can be paralyzed by another person. Whatever it is, it's locked you in, holds you hostage, and you can't budge. You're stuck. Such was this man. He was paralyzed. And even if you're not paralyzed, you know some folk who are. And the reason you know they're paralyzed is for 10 years, it ain't changed. For 10 years, they haven't budged. For 10 years, they're complaining about how it is. But it never gets any better. He's paralyzed. But the story introduces us to 4 other people. Now, we don't know their names, their backgrounds, and their history. But it says that 4 men took this man to the house. 4 men took this man for Jesus to remove his paralysis. Now, right there, we're informed of a lot. Number one, we're informed that there were 4 people in this man's life who cared about his condition. Even though he couldn't move, there were 4 men who cared for him enough, we'll call them his small group. So they cared for him, but they knew where to take him. They said, if we can get homeboy to Jesus, then we believe his circumstances in life can change. Now, I don't know how long he'd been paralyzed, but however long it was, he was a grown man who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. And you know what about men like that? Grown man, but he can't stand on his own 2 feet. You didn't hear me. A grown man, but he can't stand on his own 2 feet. But he did have some brothers in his life who helped him stand up. So they carried him. Jesus is preaching. The 4 carry the 1, and here's what we read. Being unable to get him, verse 3, in to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and when they had dug an opening, they let down the pallet on which the paralytic was lying. They lowered him right smack dab in front of Jesus. What does that tell us? That tells us that they were not going to stop until something changed. This was not casual commitment. This was some brothers who said, we're going to fight for you until we get you to the one who can change you. So before I go any further, I need to ask you, everybody in here should be in one of 2 positions. You either are a paralytic, so you're in a situation you can't fix on your own, or you ought to be somebody's friend so that you can reach down and help somebody else get to where they need to be. Because one day you may be the paralytic, and you may need some folk in your circle, your group, who will not just leave you there to languish there, but will reach down and help you get to where you need to go. You ought to be in one of the 2 categories. But today, unfortunately, we live in a day when people are just looking for their blessing. Our series is called Believing is Seeing. Watch this. Jesus seeing their faith, not hearing them talk about their faith, not examining their feelings of faith. Seeing, in other words, this was a visible faith. It was faith, but it was faith in motion, faith moving, faith that you could see, not just talking faith. Remember our definition of biblical faith. For the believer, it is acting like God is telling the truth. It's acting like it is so even when it's not so, in order that it might be so simply because God said so. That is biblical faith. Biblical faith involves movement. That's why it's called walking by faith. And Jesus visualized their faith. He's feeling this thatch falling on his head. He's looking up, seeing this guy lower down, and he's watching faith at work. Key word. Watch this. There. Not his. There. When he saw their faith. Now, the paralytic had a little bit of faith. One, because he's in the word there, and it's 5 guys, it's 4 guys plus the paralytic. But he had faith enough for the 4 to pick him up, hoist him up, and drop him down. So he had faith enough to relinquish himself into the care of caring people who were willing to trust God for him and with him until his change came. Because sometime when you've been hurt deep enough, long enough, and strong enough, you don't have enough faith to believe it can happen for you. You hear Jesus has done it for all these other folk, but you're not sure he can do it for you until some folks show up who believe where you can't believe, trust where your trust has become weak, and are willing to bring you to Jesus. He says, son, your sins are forgiven. There's a whole story there. We don't know the details of the story, but we know this much. There was a direct correlation between his sin and his circumstances. Okay? There was something wrong spiritually in his life that led to and kept him in his paralysis. So watch this. Before Jesus dealt with his circumstances, he dealt with his spiritual reality. What you have to understand is, and not all negative circumstances are due to our personal sin. Jesus says, in this world you will have tribulation. Some are just life's realities, where life has realities to them. But he specifically says, mister, before I change your circumstances, I have to deal with your spiritual condition. So what does that mean? It means the first thing you want to make sure of when you're asking for your blessing, your miracle, your supernatural presence, is that the spiritual has been addressed, that you're coming before God and giving him the freedom to address sin so that now he's free to address circumstances. Son, your sin has been forgiven. So this man was willing to entrust himself to folk who could get him to Jesus. You know, we want to entrust ourselves to folk who got connections. We want to entrust ourselves to folk who have a big name. We want to entrust ourselves to folk who have power, folk who have money, who have absolutely nothing or no concern about our spiritual condition, but in the world, they got a little something, something, so we want to entrust ourselves to them. You better find some folk in your life who know how to get a hold of Jesus and who are willing to open up the roof until they get you to the one who can deal with the spiritual. Because Jesus know all them other folk who can help you. That means that the paralytic was willing to take that risk. He was willing to take the risk these boys weren't going to drop him, and that Jesus could help him. Now, your sins are forgiven. He hadn't touched the man's circumstances. The man's still paralyzed. But his spiritual condition is now right. And that's what you want. You want the spiritual to be right so that God is free for the circumstances in accordance with his will. Well, the scribes were sitting there. These are the note takers. They're sitting there and they're saying in everyday colloquial English, say what? Because he says, they said, the scribes were sitting there reasoning in their hearts. It means thinking to themselves. Why does this man speak this way? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Translation, this man is out of his mind. Talking about your sins are forgiven, acting like he God. Oh, well. Immediately, Jesus, aware in his spirit that they were reasoning that way within themselves, said to them, why are you reasoning about these things in your heart? Now, they should have known something was different when he told them what they were thinking. Okay, they're reasoning in their heart, and he's going to come up and tell them, y'all were just thinking about how could I do this since God could only do this. That ought to have been a clue. And then he asked a question. Now, this is a great question. Jesus says, verse 9, which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and pick up your pallet and walk? Watch this now. God, Jesus says, this is what we're going to do. What we're going to do, guys, is verse 10, but so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth in history to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, get up, pick up your pallet, and go home. Now watch. Stay with me here. When God deals with you and me spiritually, which means he's been free to address our sin, and we deal with that as first and primary. The spiritual comes first, freeing him up to then, just like it takes supernatural work for God to forgive, to address our circumstances. Once he addresses our circumstances, take up your pallet and walk. The reason that he does the supernatural in the circumstances that people can see is to show them he also can deal with the spiritual that you can't see. So when God breaks through and does something outside of nature, he does it so that you become a testimony to everybody watching that the God who deals with what you can see is the God who will deal with the more important thing that you can't see, because God is first interested in the spiritual over the circumstantial, but he'll do the circumstantial so that you will know the spiritual, because the goal of the circumstantial is to bring you into relationship to the spiritual so that you have a relationship with him, the one who you saw do the physical. So when some of you begin to live this life of faith and you watch God break through, he ain't just breaking through for you. He's not just breaking through so that you can feel better, live better, walk better, talk better, spin better. He's breaking through for you so that other folk can see that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he is God, and that you are in spiritual relationship with him, which freed him up to do what they could see. In other words, your individual faith led to public sight to draw public sight back into your individual faith, your invisible faith. And when he did that, it says that the man got up immediately. Now, let me tell you the secret of when you can pretty much know you're involved in the supernatural. It's not the only way God works, but it is the dominant way God works. When you can know there's something, this ain't natural, okay? Because sometimes things you think are supernatural, you wonder, well, was this supernatural or was this just the natural working out of things, okay? So sometimes you're not sure, okay? But let me tell you when you can be like, sure. It's the word immediately. Sometimes the Bible calls it suddenly. Okay? That means out of nowhere. That means, where'd that come from? That means, whoo, I ain't see that coming. That's when God swoops down. How you going to be paralyzed for 38 years and then just jump up immediately? Come on, I need some doctor, I need a medicine, I need some surgery. But don't tell me immediately. I got my spiritual life right with God, and out of nowhere, God comes in and somebody calls me for a job immediately. I got my life right with God, and now I got my life right with God. I don't have to chase nobody. Somebody found me immediately. And when God comes out of nowhere, because you're in touch with him, and suddenly, immediately, he told him, get up. Now, the man had a responsibility, because Jesus gave the command, but he had to get up. So he had a responsibility. God's miracle involved him without it being dependent upon him, because Jesus had already spoken the word to him. So you know it's the miraculous when, out of nowhere, God enters into the situation because you've been made right with him. That's not the only way he does it, but that's a way you can know that the supernatural has intervened into your circumstance. And it closes by saying, so they were all amazed and were glorifying God, saying, we have never, ever seen anything like this. Do you have some faith God can see? I ain't talking about you talking. I ain't talking about waving your hand in the air like you just don't care. I ain't talking about that. I'm talking about where you are moving in faith, or if you can't, getting other folk to help you move in faith so that God can see y'all's faith. He saw their faith. That's why you need to be connected. You need to be connected so that where your faith is weak, you can add to somebody else. Where their faith is weak, you can add to them, they can add to you, and God sees group faith, and that's when he sees even broader collection faith. You see more happening in the community and in the nation because God sees that the group is serious, so then that means he's going to respond to faith. God responds to faith that is visible. But as you seek your supernatural presence of God, let me warn you. Let me tell you the whole truth. Let me warn you. See, when you go to the hospital and you say, this is wrong, whatever wrong is, whatever that wrong is, this is wrong with me. My back's hurting, my stomach's hurting, my head's hurting. All you have given them are symptoms. You told them how you feel. So they got the symptoms, back, stomach, head. They're not going to let it go at that. Just in case you haven't been to the hospital. They will hear you pray to them about your symptom. Back hurting, head hurting, stomach hurting. But then what they're going to do is go deeper. X-ray here, scan there. Because they know your symptom may simply be the fruit and not the root of what's really wrong. Your head may be hurting because there's a tumor. You don't know it's a tumor. You just know the symptom that it's hurting. But they're going to go deeper to find out what's really wrong. When you come to God, he's going to deal with what's really wrong. Not that camouflage stuff. And he's not going to do what many in the Christian faith do. He's not going to give you a placebo. Make you think you're getting something real when it ain't nothing in it but water. He's not going to give you a placebo because he wants you really healed. He wants you really well. He wants you really transformed. And if that means surgery, he wants to do surgery. And if that means a scope, he wants to give you a scope. Why? Because he's not just trying to fix your symptoms. You can go to Walgreens for that. He's trying to deal with the cause, give you the cure so that he heals you from the root so that now you can be blessed with the fruit. So the question is, do you really want to get made well? Or are you like the crowd? You want to be in the house, but you don't want to exercise the faith. If the truth were told, sometimes we have trouble believing. We have trouble exercising the faith that we may want to exercise, but it just seems to escape us. Well, I want you to use the strategy of Mark chapter 2, those first 12 verses, because here was a man who was in a situation he couldn't fix. But he got a few of his homeboys, a few of his buddies, a few of his friends, and they lifted him up, cut a hole in the roof, and dropped him down before Jesus. And it says, when Jesus saw their faith, he healed the man. In fact, he healed him not only physically, but healed him spiritually. Your sins are forgiven. You see, sometimes we need some help. And that's why you must be in a community of people whose faith you can piggyback on when your faith is too weak to go on its own. It would be great if in every situation we had this awesome confidence in God, but sometimes circumstances have made our spiritual immune system weak, and we just can't get there on our own. It even takes faith to entrust yourself to others who have the faith that you need to piggyback on, because this man had to allow them to pick him up, hoist him up, trust them not to drop him as they lowered him through the roof of the house, and believe that it would make a difference. Well, if you do not have some spiritual people in your life who you could lean on. I remember one time a gentleman coming to my office who was desperate, but who was weak in faith. And he just grabbed me and held on to me with tears running down his eyes, and he wanted me to believe with him because he couldn't just get it there on his own. And so I lent him what I had because he even had faith to look for faith. So make sure you don't let your weak faith stop you from getting together with others who can hoist you up as long as they're taking you to Jesus.
For most Christians, acting on your faith can be scary because it means trusting something your eyes can't always see. Tony Evans reminds us that what we see with our eyes is not as reliable as what God reveals through His Spirit. Today's message is part of an 8-part teaching series called Believing is Seeing, and you can obtain your copy by making a donation of any amount at TonyEvans.org today.
What depression, discouragement, despair often brings is distorted information. Elijah is by himself. Depression gets worse if there's nobody in your life to change your thinking. See, if you're feeling sorry for yourself and you're talking to yourself, that's a bad conversation for yourself. You're already feeling sorry, and there's nobody to talk to but you, about you, regarding you, to tell you what you ought to do, and you aren't in a place to even hear you correctly, then your discussion with yourself is helping yourself to become worse off about you. So God then enters the picture and tells him, Elijah, tell me how you feel. Stop talking to yourself. Because when you talk to yourself, you were getting depressed, you were suicidal. Start talking to me, okay? Now I'm going to show you the wind and the rain and all that stuff. Now, y'all talk to me. Because you talking to you is killing you. Since I don't want you to kill you, stop talking you to you, and y'all talk to me. God has an angel for you. He's got a person for you. He has himself for you. He gave Elijah all three of those to give him a supernatural experience to lift him out of his depression. And one of the reasons that the church exists is to have people available in your life when you are down who can embrace you, minister to you, lift you up, and he can use you to do the same thing for somebody else. Because when we are depressed, we need another perspective. That doesn't deny the reality of how we feel. But what it does is it doesn't let you live there. Israel is dealing with a problem that brought the prophet Elijah on the scene in the first place. And that is their attraction to idols. They were attracted to Baal and Asherah, Baal's girlfriend, the idols that had now consumed the culture, even those who named the name of God. We've defined an idol already, but just so that we review, an idol is an unauthorized noun, person, place, or thing that you look to get a need met. It's an unauthorized person, place, or thing, an unauthorized noun that you look to for that thing to be the source of a need being met. Something God has not approved, but you're looking to it to be the source of your provision. That's an idol. Granted, we over here don't worship trees by and large, or the moon, or the stars. Well, I can't really say that because folks are still checking their horoscopes as an unauthorized source. Because the Bible says when you check astrology to find your source and your direction based on the movement of the stars or the month you were born or any of the like, you have appealed to an unauthorized source to be the definition of your needs being met and the definition of your identity. So that is idolatry. So you may not do any of the things people may do. You just have an American idol. You just look at what's happening in the culture and you gravitate to that, whether it's people or power or possessions or whether it's prestige, whatever it is, you are looking to that thing as the source of your provision. Now, when you understand that is the biblical definition of idolatry, then you understand that you can be right here, right now, today, and be an idol worshiper. Because while you're sitting in church, God is not your source. He's a point of reference, but he's not your source. And so we have seen some of the supernatural activity of Elijah, and we've tried to say this transfers over to you today. The principle of God's supernatural work that we're discovering in his life relates to your life. We come in chapter 18, and we come to a place where now the prophet Elijah confronts King Ahab. He confronts King Ahab, and he confronts him in chapter 18, verse 17. And when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is this you, you troubler of Israel?" In other words, you getting on my nerves, Ahab says. "Is this you, Elijah, you bringing all this trouble to Israel?" Elijah responds in verse 18, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandment of the Lord and you have followed the Baals." You follow the idols. Elijah is not concerned about being politically correct. So he refuses to be politically correct. He says, "Ahab, you have brought this about because of your pursuit of idolatry. You've caused the heavens to shut up. It's no longer raining. The culture's in trouble because you have pursued another god." One of the reasons you're seeing all of this chaos around us, even in our culture and in our country, is because we have forsaken the Lord our God. And what you and I are experiencing today is God saying, you don't want me? Let me get out of the way and let me show you life without me. And so you have the consequence of the removal of God. God is being removed from government. God is being removed from schools. God is being removed from the biblical definition of marriage. God is being removed from the civics. God can't even open up a prayer at a football game. When God is being removed from the culture, that means idolatry has automatically set in, which means there are consequences that accrue in the environment where God has been removed. And that is what was happening in Israel. They're experiencing life without the one true God. So Elijah says, now send and gather to me all of Israel at Mount Carmel. Verse 19, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, that's 850, who eat at Jezebel's table. He says, okay, let's have a fight at the OK Corral. Okay? You bring your people and your God, and I'll be there at high noon. Okay? Okay. Let's settle this once and for all. Let's don't confuse people. Let's put this thing out on the table. So Ahab says, okay, you got a deal. Let's go for it. So Ahab sent, verse 20, a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Now watch this, because this is where we start. Verse 21. Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. Oh. Elijah says, all right, folk, how long you gonna keep dancing? How long will you hesitate between two opinions? The word hesitate means vacillate. How long you gonna dance? This God on Sunday and another God on Monday. How long you gonna go back and forth? How long you gonna dance around this thing? How long you gonna move back and forth? How long are we gonna have to keep doing this? How long are you gonna have to keep hearing the same sermon every week, calling you to full commitment before you make one? See, a lot of folk want to worship God on Sunday and then hug an idol on Monday. He says, how long? How many more years? How many more months? How many more services? How long are you going to dance before you decide? That's his question. It says the people were silent. Why were they silent? Simple. They weren't ready to commit. They weren't ready to commit. They weren't ready to, you too serious. You being too serious about this Christian thing. Just let me get a little church, give me a little music, preach me a little sermon, and then leave me alone. It says the people were silent. They were not ready to commit. But watch it. They were always ready for a miracle. They were always looking for a blessing. They were always looking for God to do something while they were silent. So let me state my position as coming from this passage. If you're not ready to commit and to stop dancing, stop looking for a miracle and searching for a blessing. They said nothing because they weren't ready to make a full commitment. And yet he's calling on them just to do that. So now, Elijah says, I alone, verse 22, am left the prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Elijah says, I'm outnumbered, 450 to 1. Since this is not to see how the numbers fare in my favor, I'm ready to take my stand. God is looking for some folk who, even though outnumbered, are willing to take their stand. who, even though the other side has more than you, even though it looks like you're outnumbered among your friends, among your coworkers, or what have you, he said, this is how the numbers shape up. But in spite of that, we're going to put the true God to the test. He says, why don't you bring, verse 23, 2 oxen, and let the 450 choose 1 oxen, and I'll take whichever one they don't choose, put it on the wood, put it on the altar, but don't put a fire under it. And then you 450, you call on the name of your God and tell your God, light the fire. Okay? Tell your God, be the Ohio players, fire. Tell your God to light it up. And then I'm going to call on my God. And let's see whose God is the God of fire. Now, unless you understand Baalism, you can't appreciate this, but Baal was the god of fire, the god of the sun. So you figure if Baal is in charge of the sun, he can light something up. So he's challenging him at the very core of the greatness of their God. Says, let's see what your God can do. So they agree. He is so confident in his commitment to God that he will challenge the majority. Oh, do we need some committed Christians today who are so committed and so confident in their God, they don't mind being outnumbered. Because they understand that once God, the true God, is in the equation, the numbers shift. So he says, come on, let's don't talk. Let's do this thing. Let's do this thing. And so here's what they do. The 450 agree. And so they chose the ox, and verse 26, they took the ox and prepared it in the name of Baal. And from morning to evening, they were saying, oh, Baal, answer us. But there was no voice. No one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they made. So they're in there with their God. Oh, Baal, let's have some fire. Light the altar. Oh, Baal, oh, great Baal. They jumping around the altar. They're getting their praise on around the idol. And it says, and nothing happened. And there was no voice. Now, this is where we get to a little humorous part in the Bible. It gets a little humorous here in verse 27. Because it says, at about noon, that Elijah mocked them. Okay, now it's 450 of them. And it's one of you. This ain't the time to be making fun of folk. But Elijah just standing there, and he mocks them. And look at how he mocks them. He says, why don't you call out louder? Call out verse 27 with a loud voice. Y'all ain't screaming loud enough. He can't hear you. He says, but he is a God. Maybe he's occupied. Okay? He's got another meeting going on and he can't get to y'all right now, so maybe that's why nothing happening. Or maybe he's gone aside. Now, gone aside means maybe in the bathroom. Gone aside means he's doing number 2. That's what gone aside means. Or maybe he hadn't gone aside. Maybe he's on a journey. He's on a trip. You know, he's taking a vacation. Or perhaps he's snoring. He says maybe he's asleep and you need to wake him up. So why don't you sing a little louder, praise a little louder, pray a little louder, and wake up your God. Well, all he did was tick them off, because in verse 28 it says, they cried out with a loud voice, and they cut themselves according to the custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out of them. When midday was past, verse 29, they raved until the evening sacrifice. There was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come close. Come close. So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Okay, let me stop there. It says he repaired the altar which had been torn down. That means they had religion without commitment, because the altar hadn't been used. Now, what would they do on the altar? Sacrifices. Why would they make sacrifices? To deal with sin. So what they were doing was having religion without dealing with sin. They did not want to deal with the spiritual realities in their lives because Baal let them go where they wanted to go, do what they wanted to do, act what they wanted to act. Baal did not put any boundaries or restrictions on them. And that's not the God they wanted all week. That's good enough for Sunday. Now give me my 6 days. But they wanted that God to be the God of the supernatural. So the altar was left unattended. The spiritual issues were not addressed, but yet they had enough religion to claim God. You ought to be tired of religion by now. Religion can't change you, religion can't help you, and religion certainly won't bring heaven down to earth. What you need, and I need, and we need is a relationship, but you can only have a relationship on God's terms, and you can't have a relationship on God's terms if you got another God waiting for you tomorrow. That is another source of your identity and your reality. And so Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. So the prophet comes along, and here's what happens. He took the 12 stones, verse 32. So with the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord. He got the spiritual priority back in order. And unless we do that as a church, unless that's the main thing, every other thing is a waste of time. He got the altar back, the spiritual part back, the confession of sin and the pursuit of righteousness back. The altar represented all that. And then he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. So he digs this hole around the altar. Now watch what he does here. He arranges the wood, verse 33, cuts the ox into pieces, lays it on the wood, and he said, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering. Now wait a minute. If you're trying to light up something, you don't pour water on it. You're not trying to pour water on it. You want to keep it dry so that it lights quickly. But he pours water on it. Oh, but that's not all he does. Because according to verse 24, he says, do it a second time. So they pour water on it. They wet the wood, wet the ox, wet everything. He says, pour 4 more pitchers on it. So, okay, he does it again. Oh, but is he finished? No, do it a 3rd time. And they did it a 3rd time. So he prays. And he prays at the evening sacrifice, O Lord, verse 36, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenant-keeping God, today let it be known that you are God in Israel. I am your servant, and notice this, I have done all the things at your word. Let it be known what you will do when people are committed to you and your word. In other words, I'm not like y'all, I ain't dancing. I'm not like y'all, I'm not going back and forth. I am totally committed to his word. That's how you know if you're dancing or not. He says, let it be known that I'm for real because I obey your word. In other words, God, your word has the final say-so over my decisions. Until you get to that place, you're not fully committed. If you're not fully committed, you have limited or lost access to the miraculous. So he says, I have kept your word. Answer me, O Lord, verse 37. That this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again. And the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and licked up the water in the trench. Now, this is one of the scenes I want to see on instant replay when I get to heaven. Because it not only said the fire fell, but it says it consumed the stones, the wood and the stone. But here's the part I like. It said it licked up the water around the trench. Oh, and when you see God show off and show out for you, when you see him do exceedingly abundantly above all you can ask or think, when you see, because you've rebuilt the altar of full commitment, he said he saw it. And then the people saw it. They fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Does anybody here know what a hillbilly road bump is? A hillbilly road bump is an armadillo dead in the middle of a road. That's what's called a hillbilly, country people call it a hillbilly road bump, okay? Now let me explain. 500,000 armadillos every year are killed in the middle of the road. Every time I've seen an armadillo, it's on its back and its legs is sticking up in the air. Every time I see an armadillo, it's dead in the middle of the road. Because here's what they do. They start crossing the road. They stop in the middle of the road. They stop in the middle of the road with cars coming. They stopping in the middle of the road with cars coming, and they get run over. They get run over because they get comfortable in the middle of the road. Does God have any hillbilly road bump Christians in this place? Does God have any hillbilly road bump Christians? You come to church and you stay in the middle. You like Malcolm in the middle. You stay in the middle. You want to be able to step over here to the God of the Bible, but you want to stay over here to the world. You stay in the middle only to be run over by his glory when he moves down the center. But if he can ever get you to go all the way, heaven will open up. You will see heaven open, Jesus said. You will see the angels of God going up and down the Son of Man, and you will see what God can do because you've given him all you have. God is looking for some folk who gonna leave the middle and go all the way. The dominant sin spoken of in the Bible is idolatry. All through Scripture, you see God's hatred of idolatry. Idolatry is any unauthorized noun, person, place, thing, or thought that you look to as your source, because that means you're committed to a false God. There's only one true God, the God of the Holy Scriptures, who's revealed himself both in creation and in his word. And he does not want any competing loyalties in our lives. He wants us totally committed to the one true God. The moment you bring another God, another noun, person, place, thing, or thought, that you look to as your ultimate source, you've created divine competition. You've created a deity competitor. And nothing will drive God from you in terms of you experiencing his presence in your life like you inviting another God into the vicinity. Whether that God is money, or whether that God is even religion, whether that God is education, whether that God is career, well, you can name it. But once that thing or person becomes